Hello, everyone. Welcome to COEX Talk. Today, we have a very, very special friend and guest, Angelica Rubio. She's New Mexico's legislator, and she will talk a little bit about her path on becoming like a legislator, what it took. So, Angelica, welcome, and let us know a little bit. We want to hear your story. So, let's start with learning a little bit more about who you are and how you got involved in this.
No, thank you, Maria. It's a pleasure to spend time with you all today. I've just come off of a long 60-day session and then a special session last week, which I can talk a little bit more later about. These are the sort of spaces that I really enjoy because I feel like it's an opportunity to really connect with the people that and the communities that I tend to work with on a day-to-day basis. So I am a community organizer when I am not a legislator. And so for me, a community organizer, my community organizing work is 15, I think like over 15 years now. I was born and raised in the southeastern part of the state of New Mexico in a little town called Lake Arthur, just north of Artesia. If folks are familiar, Artesia, if you speak Spanish. And my parents immigrated from Mexico about a little over 60 years ago, and that's where they settled. I'm the youngest of 6, and so cool. I always like to say that I have a working idea of how to build power in numbers because I've done it since I was a little kid. And so, yeah, my work has mostly been just my development into who I've become. I think has a lot to do with just my parents. They were farm workers. My mom was a domestic worker cleaning offices at one of the biggest oil companies in Artesia. My dad was a farm worker. He's still, up until now, he's about to turn 84 at the end of the month. And he still likes to ride around in the tractor. That's his sanctuary. So his love for the outdoors, although it was filled with a lot of hard work, I think I get a lot of that from him, and my love for my bike and being outside, which is such a privilege for me to be able to do in comparison to my parents. But I think a lot of their work, the efforts that my siblings have put into their own lives has really instilled in me just this wanting to just help people, not only just help people in terms of advocacy, but really to develop leaders to step into their own power and to build power for our communities, and to make sure that we address issues like white supremacy and environmental justice and racial justice, and that's really where I'm centered, not only in my community organizing work, but as well as my legislative work.
So big question here. How would you explain the work of a legislator to a person that doesn't know anything about politics, that doesn't know anything about this field? Because the reality is that a lot of people don't understand politics. So how can you simplify this word that is so important for our community to understand, but yet we need to use simple words to communicate properly? So how do you define legislation?
So
and you can take a lot of words to define it.
Yeah, no, it'll take a lot of words, because I think it's also sort of shifting our way of thinking in terms of, like, there's politics and then there's public service, and that's how I approach my work in the state legislature. And the way that I explain it to our communities is, of course, everyone knows, most of the time, everybody knows who their mayor is, who their city councilor is, maybe.
Yeah.
Everyone might know who the president of the United States is, but nobody, rarely, if any, really understand what a state legislature is. And a state legislature is probably the most important institution, because we actually impact people's lives every single day by passing budgets statewide that give back to communities, counties around the state. And so for me, I represent the city of Las Cruces. I came back to Las Cruces. I did my undergrad here back in 2000. I graduated in 2001. And I came back about close to 8 years ago. And it was through my community organizing work where I led with the organization that I worked with at the time, New Mexico Cafe, to lead the minimum wage campaign. And it was this huge effort that we had to raise the wage here to $10.10. And we did it through a ballot initiative. And it was through that work that I very much connected with local policymakers. And so what I like to explain to people is that while you have your city council who writes codes and things like street parking and making sure that your neighborhoods are in good condition, that your roads are in good condition, that me as a state legislator representing downtown Las Cruces and all of these important historic districts in the area and these traditional neighborhoods in the area, that it's through the efforts that I make in Santa Fe at our state capital that essentially helps to bring in even more money to supplement the needs of our communities here. So I'm not a congresswoman. I don't know how many times people like to call me Congresswoman Rubio. I never want to go to Washington, D.C. I lived there for a while. Never do I want to go back and work in Capitol Hill. I'll tell you that right now. So I'm not a congresswoman, and yet I'm not a city councilor or a mayor. We're sort of in between that. And so there's so many layers to our democracy around the country that I always say that while everybody's paying attention to what's happening at the federal level, really politics is local. And this is really where not only within your city council, but within our state legislature. For us in New Mexico, it's unfortunate because, and it's like this in several other states where we only meet once a year. We're not like in California where people are more aware of who their assembly people are because they're a full-time professional assembly. They have their state senators and their assembly people. Here in New Mexico, we only meet 60 and 30 days every other year. And on the 30-day sessions, it's only budget related, which means that anything that I want to introduce next year, it has to be specifically related to money. Otherwise, I have to wait 2 more years. I also don't get paid for this. So we are the only state in the country that is a citizen legislature. So not only do I have my full-time job, which is as a consultant, as an organizer, but I don't get paid to legislate. Like the times that I spend in Santa Fe, all the work that I do in the interim, it's all based on per diem. I don't actually get a day-to-day salary if at all. And those are actually one of the priorities that I'm working on in the long term as I serve legislature, is that I believe New Mexico deserves to have a maybe not full-time legislature, but we should certainly be meeting as often as we need to, because so many communities rely on us to do the work and not have to wait for us.
Okay, following question. How do you get appointed then to be a legislator?
So I have to run. So I have an election every 2 years. If you're a state senator in New Mexico, it's every 4 years, but here under the Constitution, it's every 2 years. So that's why sometimes when it looks like we don't ever get anything done, it's because everyone always seems to be running for election every 2 years. And so that's why, yeah, it takes up, so you do all this work in 1 year. Like this year, I focused a lot on really good pieces of public policy. But because I know that next year it's just going to be all budget related, and then as soon as that's over, it's election year again. And so it's this is my third term. I just entered my third term, and that means this is the start of my 5th year in the legislature.
Wow. Do you wish to continue to do this for a long time? I hope you do, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm not one to support like term limits, because for me, it's like term limits are elections. We need to encourage people to go out and vote. And that to me is your, like, la gente should be taking me out if it's time for me to move on. But I say that also knowing that it also is a huge learning curve. So it's like, I'm still barely entering my 5th year, and there's still so many things that I don't know about the legislature, that it just requires so much learning. And power is like, knowledge is power. Like, there's a lot of legislators, both in the House and the Senate, who just know so much, and they use that to their advantage because that's how they get things done. And so I think for me, part of why I think it's important to also pay legislators is because right now it's a privilege to be able to serve in the legislature. One, because it's a privilege, but two, it's a privilege because only those who have money get to run for office. And so I don't know. My hope is that as long as I'm in the legislature, I can encourage more people that have similar stories like mine, who are from the community, who are much closer to the struggle and to the pain, to be able to run for office. Because I think that's what we need right now, are people in these leadership positions who can really write public policy that is actually helping our communities.
Claudia, do you have a question for?
Yeah, I do. Going back to, you mentioned that you were working with raising the minimum wage. What do you say to those who argue against raising the minimum wage? You know, there's a lot of arguments that say, oh, well, it'll just be the corporations and big businesses are going to just hike up the prices on everything, and we're going to be back where we started. What do you say to people like that? How do you present the benefits of raising the minimum wage?
I mean, I think for me, it's really just the values. It's really based on values. Like, I believe in dignified wages. I think that people, especially, we saw this with COVID-19 and the global pandemic, how we have essential workers who were on the front lines of providing for everyone, and yet this past year, and I'm hearing that the governor's going to sign it into law tomorrow, is I introduced legislation for paid sick leave. And so New Mexico will have probably one of the strongest paid sick leave policies in the country starting next year. We had to delay it a year as part of the compromise, but for me, it's really about dignity. Like, what kind of community do we want to live in if some of the people who are on our front lines aren't even able to support their families, that they have to have 2 to 3 jobs to have even just somewhat of a livelihood for their people. I mean, I think the issue has become so politicized, but I think it's also been hijacked by people like the chamber and others who, I mean, so much of the talking points that have been used to counter increases in minimum wage or paid sick leave are the same talking points that we heard back in the 30s and the 40s. Every single time any conversation arises around increasing the minimum wage or any type of worker benefit, it always seems like it's the same job. We're killing jobs. Businesses are going to fail. Like it's like all this fear mongering, things that have never happened.
Small business is going to do.
Yeah, and so what we've seen time and time again over the course of the decades is that none of that has ever happened. In fact, we've been able to flourish in so many different ways when we actually center not just workers, but also small businesses. And the thing is that we do too much. We build a wedge too much between small businesses and workers, when it should be around how do we target corporations who don't pay any money, any taxes ever. And so I think for me, it's really about like that whole idea of dignified wages, but also we have to have a bigger conversation around the corporate giveaways that and the handouts that we give out, and not criticize those who are being impacted,
who are actually struggling.
Yeah,
and people are struggling because of these. Most of the time it's because of these big businesses that are just taking advantage, and like, oh, we have to pay people more, but they don't want to fund it out of their profit margin or overhead, and they just pass it down to consumers, and they're the ones that make it cyclical.
Yeah.
And then I had another question for you. Is there any work, legislations or anything being worked on in New Mexico to support the one person, one vote and ending gerrymandering and uneven voting districts?
Yeah, so this is census. The census was last year, for folks who are watching and don't know. And so this year, state legislators are responsible for basically drawing lines for districts all around the state. And this includes congressional districts and things like that. And so what we did this past session, we'll go back into session later this year, and it's basically just focused on redistricting. And so I've never participated in a redistricting in my life, so this will be my very first experience. But in the way that New Mexico has traditionally worked in this situation is that the state legislature actually does all the redrawing of the lines. And so in other places, you'll have like a third party who participates or whatever. Here in the state of New Mexico, that's not how it has happened in the past. And so this past year, we passed legislation that will continue to support that that process. But over the course of the last year, there had been advocates who'd been working within coalitions to change it and bring in a third party. However, while that legislation didn't pass, it does allow for a greater focus on bringing in people outside of just legislators. So it'll be, hopefully it'll be much more equitable in terms of what that redistricting will look like. But I mean, I can't overstate how political it is too. Like people have been drawing the lines in order to retain power for, I mean, that's what the whole purpose of, not the purpose, but this is the mechanism in which legislators who know the process like to wield their power is in through this process. And so it'll be an interesting process for me to watch personally as a legislator, because one, I've never participated in it, and two, we'll see how it goes. I think a lot of people are eyeing like the congressional district 2 here in New Mexico. We only have 3 congressional districts, which means that CD2, which was held previously by Xochitl Torres Small, and is now being represented by Yvette Harrell. Everyone's looking at that district because it also is fairly large. I mean, New Mexico land-wise is huge, but in terms of people, it's still very rural and very frontier. And so there's going to be a lot of conversations around that over the course of the next year. I am a participant in Fusion. So basically with the Working Families Party nationwide, they've been working to allow for progressives to not only be on the ballot as Democrats, for example, but also as I think under the working party's family. So you would be on the ballot twice, but that, because people feel like people need to know that a candidate is as more progressive than your typical Democrat, because not all Democrats are progressive either. Yeah. So those are some of the issues that I'm actually I'm part of a group of other legislators who signed on to this case to allow for Fusion to be part of our ballot here in New Mexico. I don't know if that will ever happen in the near future, but that's something that I've been a part of over the course of the last couple of years.
So I have another question, COVID related. I hate talking about COVID, but we have to. So in terms of, you said in terms of legislation and budgeting and all these things, how has it affected budget what was your experience when COVID hit and suddenly the shift in budgets have to change, right? I'm assuming, or maybe that's what I want to ask you, like, the needs of people change drastically overnight, right? Oh, we have a pandemic. So what was your experience or your resiliency or adaptation, or how things were affected by COVID? And how can, if you have some advice to us, like the community, how can we support you
Yeah.
and you know?
It's a really great question. So I think for me, and not just for me, but I think for several people. So our House of Representatives here in New Mexico, I feel is very young and progressive in terms of our ideas. Um, and many of us have been calling out inequities for several years now. We've all known, many of us have known that access to connectivity and like broadband was problematic. Many of us knew that there was a lot of inconsistencies when it came to access to healthcare and all of that. When we talk about essential workers and having to be on the front lines, delivering our food, be working at the grocery stores in the midst of a global pandemic, like that is why, I mean, many of us were already talking about paid sick leave and increases in wages well before COVID hit. And so I think what was different for many, and then housing was a big deal, has always been a big deal for me because New Mexico actually ranks pretty high in homelessness. And one of my biggest fears, along with one of the other legislators that I worked with on this issue, is we were telling people to stay home, except many were facing evictions because they were in the midst of losing their jobs because of COVID. So like but these were all inequities that many of us were already very familiar with. What COVID did was finally unveil to the many that we'd been trying to convince all these years that these issues were important. It was a global pandemic that actually like enlightened a lot of people. And so, for example, with the housing piece last April, around this time, we had a caucus meeting within our Democratic Party, within our legislature, House of Representatives, and everybody was just sort of talking about like the economy and all these other things, which were important. But myself and Representative Romero, who represents Santa Fe, we were like, okay, all those things are important, but people are going to get evicted. And if they're required to stay home during a global pandemic, where are they going to go? And so for the whole year, we worked on a housing package so that we were trying to get like the CARES money. So the federal money that came down last spring to support states and local governments, we wanted some of that money to go to prevent evictions.
Okay.
And we asked the governor to put it on the call for the special session. That didn't happen. And then later on in the year, we had another special session. We put it on the call. That didn't happen again. And then this past session that just ended, we had this very robust housing package or legislation that we introduced, and it died in Senate Judiciary, and it was just held there. And so my point though is that we're there, while we've made a lot of progress in terms of enlightening people on what equities exist, there's still a lot of work to be done. Some of the successes this past session, of course, was broadband. New Mexico is finally creating an office of broadband because we didn't have one. So now we can have a centralized office to oversee not only what's happening in New Mexico, but all the federal funding that's coming down to help with broadband. We can have better coordination there to our rural communities. Again, paid sick leave. That's I'm hearing that the governor is going to sign our bill tomorrow. We here in New Mexico are heavily reliant on oil and gas to pay for all of all of the things that we need, and so the governor today or tomorrow is signing another bill to create a sustainable sorry, my mind just went blank, but it's a sustainable economy task force that incorporates just transition language. And so like my whole purpose during this last session was to make this session as transformational as possible. And while I didn't get to see all the things that I wanted passed, I think if anything, COVID began to unravel a lot of what many of our communities have been saying for many years. And so I think that's where we made the adjustments, is that I think we were able to shift narratives in terms of all the work that community organizers have been doing across the state for years and across the country. It finally hit for many people that, oh snap, we should have been doing this a long time ago.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a lot. So Angelica, you know, you're in Las Cruces, and we've had this conversation about the boundary, the border. So do you work closely with El Paso? We're so close and we're one. So I know you have, like, we have shared in conversations previously, like how there's a lot of efforts on like uniting the border. So what's your experience on like cross borders, or like working together with El Paso on initiatives?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I pride myself in calling myself a fronteriza. My parents are, like I said, are from Ojinaga. Yeah, my parents are from Ojinaga. My dad was born in Presidio. A lot of my family live in and around like the Marfa, like Odessa, all these areas where are very much part of like the borderlands. And so for me, this is probably the most critical region, I would say, in the world, because you have the United States, which is, I guess, economically still one of the most like financially capable countries in the world, bordering Mexico, which is another country that is fully like capable of providing for their country. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, the borderlands have been neglected for so long. Like there are thousands and thousands of miles of land where people live, where wildlife live, that I think it's important for all of us to figure out how to not only like raise awareness about how beautiful the borderlands are and what a wonderful place it is, because it is. And I think past administrations have painted it as this awful, like desolate place where just tumbleweeds are just like rolling across like the desert. But no, it's filled with like culture and vibrancy and so many opportunities. And so one of the things, and this is what COVID, I think, did in that forced us to do, is we had to focus so specifically on our communities that it sort of took away our imagination around cross coordination with other places. So like previously, right before COVID, I am part of what's called the CSG, which stands for something state governance. I forget what it is, but every year they bring state legislators from the border together, from both Mexico and the United States. And so I was in Mexico City back in September of 2019, super excited because I was going to get to work. We had so many cool ideas about what we could do with states like in Chihuahua and Sinaloa and all these other places. And then COVID hit. And so I think we're now just starting to think about like what other opportunities might we be able to have once people are vaccinated and things start to, like, I certainly don't want to go back to normal because normal sucked for a lot of our communities, but like what's our new normal that will help everyone. And
I think it's an opportunity to create something new, not going back to normal.
Yeah,
normal was never normal, like the quote out there.
Yeah,
we have an opportunity to build something better.
Yeah, no, I agree. And so that's how I feel about this binational like opportunity, me as a legislator, like how can I use my role as a legislator to speak on behalf of Southern New Mexico, La Frontera, with my counterparts in Mexico as well.
Yeah.
But then also what are our opportunities with, I know that we as a legislature do a lot of work with like Sunland Park because of Santa Teresa.
Yes.
I think that there's opportunities to do work with city officials in El Paso as well. I personally don't have a lot of relationships within the city of El Paso or the city of Juarez. But like I said, it's certainly something that I want to begin to develop because I think I was on the cusp of really starting to get that going for myself. And then once COVID hit, it just sort of put us in a standstill of having to focus primarily here in Las Cruces and in the state.
Yeah. Well, Angelica, I don't know if Claudia has any last questions for you. Just trying to wrap it up because our time is almost over, but Claudia?
I just have one question. So I saw you were an interim of the member of the Water and Natural Resources Committee for New Mexico. Is that correct?
Yeah, so in the interim, I serve on a number of interim committees. We don't actually get to do we don't get to vote on anything. It's mostly where we do all of our homework and we get all of these presentations done related to the topics within those committees. So the Water and Natural Resources happens to be one of those committees that I sit on.
Okay, and my question was, are there any natural resources, I guess, programs or any legislature related to natural resources that are coming up for New Mexico, like maybe wildlife or water protection or anything like that? That voters should be, it's especially since we're like environmental type organization.
Yeah.
That's kind of important to touch on. So is there anything that voters should be keeping an eye for, looking forward to, or being aware of?
Yeah, so in terms of like elections themselves, I mean, I think what we did this past legislative session, and Matt, what you should all think of, start looking at for the next session starting in January is, I'm part of I guess a cohort within our legislature who are working really hard to address issues related to climate change. And for me, one of the bills that I mentioned earlier that is being signed by the governor either today or tomorrow is Senate Bill 112, which creates a sustainable economy task force. For me, what I believe is that we address climate change much quicker when we focus on it, when we focus on economic issues at the center, because so many workers will be impacted by it. I grew up in the Permian Basin, and so much of my family works directly with oil and gas. And so for me, it's really like, as important as climate change is, I'm also trying to figure out ways to diversify our economy so that we don't rely so heavily on oil and gas. And so for me, the Sustainable Economy Task Force is a mechanism that we were able to pass this past session. But what was really important that we were able to do at the last minute is incorporate just transition language that was inserted into that bill. So a lot of people will say, oh, it's just a task force. Yes, it's a task force, but we were able to codify a workforce development study that I was able to find money to pay for through the Department of Workforce Solutions, which is sort of our labor department here in New Mexico, in conjunction with the University of New Mexico, to interview over 1,200 people all around the state, particularly from frontline communities, to ask them, like, do you believe in a green economy? Like, what will a green economy look like to you? It was just this really important conversation that folks were having, especially as oil and gas collapsed last March, and in the midst of COVID starting up. Like, we weren't even expecting that many conversations to happen because it was going to all be virtual. We had over 1,200 people participate.
Wow.
And it was pretty amazing. And so all of the findings that we were able to have from that study was codified and inserted into the Senate Bill 112. In addition to that, we were also able to create within this task force an advisory council that is predominantly centering Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. And we were able to put all of that language within this bill, which means that now, like, every department that has been specified within this legislation now has to basically follow sort of this this roadmap that we're trying to accomplish about how we get closer to not only diversifying our economy away from oil and gas, but that we put frontline workers and families at the center to make sure that they're the ones that are getting to decide what those new industries are. And that one for me, which was important, is that not only do we diversify away from oil and gas, but that we, if we're gonna expand industries here in the state of New Mexico, that we do it in a way that is centered on people, but also on the planet and on wildlife, but that it's also non-exploitative, because I also don't want us to be so invested in industries that are once again going to perpetuate the very same thing that oil and gas has done here in the state of New Mexico.
Wow, that's super cool, Angelica.
Yeah, it's exciting. You know, and part of the reason that Senate Bill 112 was so critical for us is because it was coalition work, really. Like, if I'm successful in the legislature and I'm able to pass legislation, it's because so much of the process starts as early as right now. And so part of that cohort that I'm talking about within the legislature is that there's a lot of us who are very environmentally focused on policy. And so, like, this week, even though the session just ended, we're already going to meet this week to start working on a policy platform for next year, because next year we want climate to be a priority at the upcoming session next January.
So I really like this approach because most of the time as environmentalists, the most common thing we hear out there is, oh, let's end oil industry. Yeah. Yes, we have to, but we cannot just do it overnight. It takes a process and it takes a lot of effort to actually get that going, and it's gonna be a while. But if we don't talk about alternatives for the people that do rely and depend on the oil industry, which is most of us, we all have cars, right? Can we afford electric cars right now? Not all of us. So it's all these things, like looking at it at a comprehensive level, like, yes, we want to end this, but here's some other options. That's the important thing when we are messaging out there. We cannot just end one thing and just expect things to continue. We have to have a backup plan of how we're going to be executing these things. So thank you so much for sharing all of the information. This was amazing. We honor your time, and we really value the work that you're doing. And please know that you have us here in El Paso as a connection.
Yeah, no, and I was gonna say that I mean, for me, I think it's really important to build those relationships, because I think, like, it's really important to build those relationships. So I am very much open to having some ongoing conversations, and if there's anyone or any groups or anyone that I should be talking with who are interested in doing some sort of coalition work or collaboration to address sort of this bi-state, tri-state, binational issues, I'm certainly down to do that.
Yes, well, I do have people in mind, so I'll email you sometime soon, because I do have some people that I think it would be great to connect and have conversations about it.
No, that sounds great.
Well, thank you so much, Angelica. Claudia, I don't know if you want to say something.
No, thank you. This was a great conversation, and I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us out of your busy day, busy schedule.
No, actually this week I'm trying to take time off this week because I injured my knee, and so it's forced me to actually have to slow down. So you caught me in a week where I'm pretty chill. I'm not like stressed out or anything. So I'm just wanting to get healed, and that's really my priority at this point.
Well, thank you so much for still having us and making the time for us.
No, absolutely.
We look forward to more of your work here, and please stay connected with us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Maybe I'll once I'm healed, I'll ride my bike down to
Yes. Yes.
Paso right before it gets way too hot to do it during the day.
It would be amazing.
You're welcome to come.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Yeah. All right. You all have a good one.
You too. Bye.
Bye.